Great Responsibility, Chapter 38, On the Rooftop. Piper turned her phone off as she walked through downtown. She just needed to think for a while. Without the near-constant buzzing of her phone in her pocket, the team could yell at her for missing training again later. Eddie had offered her his slightly broken couch for the night, but she had needed some air after the revelation of the day. Her whole world had just been turned on its ear. Everything she had ever thought she knew about her parents was a lie. It was likely that her Uncle Ben had known her parents worked for S.H.I.E.L.D. from the beginning. Her father had given him the USB after all, and he'd hidden it well. Fury definitely knew. Tony, the man she considered her father, probably knew. Yet no one, in the past 12 years since her parents' deaths, had thought that maybe she deserved to know the truth. Not Fury, who she technically worked for, and not Tony, who had become family to her. She shook her head, sighing. She took a left into an alley she nearly always swung through as Spider-Girl. She was so distracted she didn't notice the figure behind her until she heard the flick of a switchblade being opened. She knew better than to freeze. She really did. She lived in New York her whole life, with only occasional trips to Malibu. She knew how to react to a mugging. Hell, she stopped muggings on the regular. But only as Spider-Girl. Never as Piper. She knew better, she really did, but still her muscles decided it was a good idea to freeze solid at that moment, and she stumbled. The man behind her took his chance and grabbed her wrist, slamming her into the wall. She managed a short scream before he got his hand over her mouth. He smelled like beer and cigarette smoke. His breath reeked like spoiled milk. His hand began to slide down her arm and she struggled. She could have thrown him across the alley with ease and was a mere second away from doing so when something came crashing out of the shadows and tackled the man, knocking him away from Piper and into the dumpster a few feet away. Any sensible person would have run. But no one who knew Piper well would ever accuse her of being sensible. Instead of running, she took a step forward, towards the shadowy figure now beating on the mugger. There was a pained groan from the man, and Piper jumped slightly, still shaken up. Her foot connected with a can behind her, and it sent it spinning into the wall. The shadowy figure leapt up the wall, sticking there in a very familiar way, and began to crawl up the wall at top speeds. Piper called after him after glancing over at the mugger to make sure he wasn't getting back up anytime soon. Wait! There was silence for a moment. Piper thought her rescuer might have left her alone in that alley, but then there was a sound familiar only to herself and the few people who'd worked with Spider-Girl. The sound of a webline being shot. Her rescuer lowered himself down to her level, and Piper got a decent look at him in the dim light of the alley. The costume was the same as before, and the eyes still kind of gave her the heebie-jeebies, but knowing who it was under the mask helped ease that a touch. She could hear his smile in his voice as he spoke. "I see trouble knows how to find you, miss." Piper rolled her eyes, glancing over at the mugger to make sure he was out before she spoke. "Miss? Harry, you aren't slick. I know it's you." The Spider-Man dropped down on his webline slightly, but chuckled. "You are way too smart for your own good, Piper." Piper's already small smile dropped a notch. Harry tilted his head slightly before flipping off the line to stand directly in front of her. "You look down." Piper ran a hand through her hair and sighed. "Yeah, that's one way of putting it." Harry reached out a hand. "I know just the thing. Do you trust me?" Piper giggled slightly. Harry was very secretive about it, but he was a closet Disnerd. "Of course I trust you, Harry," she said as she reached out and took his hand. Moving faster than a regular human was capable of, Harry pulled Piper close and slipped a hand around her waist so they stood close, facing each other. "Good. Hold on tight." Piper was about to ask him what he meant when his arm around her tightened and he shot a web line at the top of the nearest building. Piper threw her arms around his neck as he pulled them up out of the alley. They swung across the city, and Piper couldn't help the belt of laughter that escaped. No matter what, there was nothing like a good web swing to clear the head. They were across downtown in a matter of minutes, and with a mighty tug, Harry pulled them to the top of Stark Tower. He gently set her down and brushed her hair behind her ear again, much like he had the first time he'd set her up here. Piper laughed and took his hand. "Thank you, Harry. That was fun." Spider-Man glanced around, and the mask peeled itself back. Piper stared. She still wasn't sure what the suit was, but the way it moved and the symbol on his chest were eerily familiar. Harry smiled and tilted her chin up gently. "There's the smile I love. He didn't hurt you, did he, the man in the alley?" Piper shook her head. "No, you got there just in the nick of time." Harry's smile looked different somehow. Darker. "Good. I'll always be there for my favorite damsel in distress." Piper scoffed. "I'm no damsel in distress, Harry, but thank you." Harry grinned a bit wider. "You're welcome." He leaned in and pecked Piper on the cheek. Then, without warning, he dove backwards off the roof, his mask sliding back into place on its own. Piper stared after him, her hand absently touching the spot on her cheek that he'd kissed. "Oh, I'm in trouble," she sighed and headed for the roof entrance door. She had some research to do on symbiosis. "Mr. Stark, Miss Parker has arrived home." Tony glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. "Thanks, Jarvis. Redirect the elevator to this lab, please," Tony said before turning back to his latest project. It took the elevator a few minutes to ding, signaling its arrival. The doors opened and Piper stuck her head out of them. She stepped into the room. It wasn't often that Tony called her down to this particular lab. It was his main armory at Stark Tower, and normally he only called her here to show her something or tell her she was in trouble. "Hi, everything okay?" Tony nodded. He glanced up at her and frowned. She looked like she'd been crying. "I'm fine. Looks like I should be asking you that question. Did something happen?" Piper shook her head. "I don't want to talk about it right now." Tony shrugged. "Okay, well, the reason I called you down here was because I have something for you." Tony turned to his work table and picked up 2 red bands. He motioned for Piper to hold out her hands. She did so, knowing that her web shooters were at the bottom of her backpack and wouldn't get in the way of whatever this was. Tony slipped the bands onto her wrists. On closer inspection, Piper saw that they were in fact red and gold, the same shades as the Iron Man armor. They were about 1.5 inches wide. There was a small gem-like circle on each band. Piper raised an eyebrow at Tony. "They're for your protection. Push the button." Piper pushed the button on the left hand, and the metal sprang to life and unfolded around her hand. The familiar sound of a repulsor blast charging up filled Piper's ears. The other glove came to life on its own seconds after the first, forming another glove. "Cool! But why?" Tony flicked a switch on the side of the gloves, and they folded back into the bands. "Like I said, for your protection. Too much has been happening at your school lately, and since you won't let me transfer you or even homeschool you, I'm doing my bit to keep you safe." He handed her 2 more metal bands. These were bigger and shaped like a shoe. "Slip those on the soles of your shoe. I want to see if they're too heavy. I gutted almost everything, and you'll only have about 5 minutes of flight before they die out, but they should get you away from any danger faster than running should. Please don't argue with me about this. This is for my own sanity, if nothing else." Piper nodded slightly and slipped the bands onto her shoes. They added a bit of weight, but nothing she couldn't handle. She thanked him and made her excuses, heading off to bed. Tony frowned after her. "Jarvis, did she seem off to you?" Tony asked, eyes still locked on the elevator. "I believe she is upset, Mr. Stark." Tony nodded and glanced at his workbench. He sighed and walked over to the elevator. "Take me to the kitchen. I need 2 grilled cheeses and 2 cups of tea." Jarvis called the elevator down once Piper was off of it and started up the chef bot. Tony might be a decent father, but he was no cook. Chapter 39. Trust. Piper frowned as her fingers flew across her keyboard. The kind of symbiosis that came with venom wasn't the same as any kind of symbiosis that existed in nature. Most symbiotic relationships in nature were beneficial to both parties. But with venom, it seemed that the relationship was entirely beneficial only to the symbiote. Piper sighed as she skimmed through yet another article about a symbiotic relationship between fish. There was a knock at her door. She called for whoever it was to come in, and was a bit surprised when a plate of grilled cheese sandwiches and a large bowl of tomato soup was set down beside her computer. She looked up, and a small smile worked its way onto her face. Tony smiled and pulled up Piper's second desk chair. One of the dummy bots had been following Tony and set down a mug of hot chocolate with whipped cream and chocolate syrup. Piper's smile turned a bit more genuine. Tony took a sip of hot chocolate from his own mug.
You seem a bit down, Pipes. I know being a teenager is hard, believe me. I know, I was a terror of a teen. But maybe that was because I didn't feel like I had anyone to talk to. I just want you to know I'm here for you, no matter what.
Piper picked up a square of sandwich and dunked it in the soup before taking a bite and chewing slowly. Tony waited for her to speak. She swallowed her bite of sandwich and stood. She stepped over to her bed and pulled a book out from under it. It was an old photo album. She sat back down in her chair and flipped the album open to the very back. There were a few loose photos tucked into the back of it. She searched through them for a moment before stopping on one photo. Without looking up, she spoke. We never talk about my parents. Tony frowned. She was right. They had never really talked about her parents. He had never brought it up because he knew how painful it could be when someone ripped open old wounds.
You never asked. I didn't want to open old wounds for you.
Piper nodded and pulled the photo she was looking at out of the album, handing it over to Tony. It was an old photo of him and Piper's parents. In it, he was shaking hands with her father. He smiled lightly at the photo. You knew them well? Tony nodded.
Yes, I did.
Piper looked up, tears in her eyes. Did you know they were S.H.I.E.L.D. agents? Tony was a bit surprised, but he nodded.
I did. They saved my life when I first took over Stark Industries. Someone tried to assassinate me. Was never sure who was behind it. They didn't say who they worked for back then. It didn't really matter to me. I told them if they ever needed anything to come to me. A few years later, they did. They wanted out of the agency they were working for. They wanted to settle down and raise a family. Your father was a brilliant electrical engineer, and your mother was only slightly less badass than Natasha. I gave them both jobs. Your mother was my head of security for a while. Your father helped design the IntelliCrops. They had you about 3 years after they came to Stark Industries.
Tony ran a hand through his hair and sighed.
Not too long after you turned 2, they got an offer from someone else for a new job. They took it. I never knew why. They turned up working at Oscorp not too long after. I don't know if Oscorp made them a better offer, or if S.H.I.E.L.D. got them back into the agency somehow, but less than a year later, the plane they were on went down. I didn't hear anything else about them until you showed up on my doorstep with the social workers.
Piper frowned. The social workers knew about my parents. Tony sighed.
One of the women who brought you to the Malibu house wasn't actually a social worker. Her name is Maria Hill. She's an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. And she was there to make sure I took you in that day.
Piper's frown deepened. What? Why? Tony shook his head.
S.H.I.E.L.D. had been shadowing you for a while, trying to make sure nothing bad happened to you.
Piper scoffed. Tony nodded.
I never said they did a good job of it. When they found out your uncle died, they sent Maria to take you in. Your parents were brilliant agents. According to Maria, Fury thought you could be too. Since you didn't have any family or anyone else to take you in, no one would really notice, in theory. Then you found your parents' will, which listed me because your father made me your godfather when you were born. Maria knew it was possible that I wouldn't take you in. I wasn't in a good place back then, we both know that.
Piper nodded.
She pulled me aside and explained what would happen if I didn't take you in. If I didn't, Fury would. And because he's fury, he would have sent you off to some military shield academy at the ripe old age of 11. He would have completely robbed you of your childhood and molded you into what he wanted you to be, not what you wanted to be. I couldn't let you go through that. I had been there. My father had shipped me off to boarding school first chance he got. So I took you in. I honestly didn't expect to care about you, but I swear you have a superpower, kid. You can make anyone care about you. They just have to get to know you first.
Tony reached over and rubbed Piper's shoulder. Piper looked up from the album in her hands. What she'd heard from Tony meshed with what Dr. Connors had told her, and with the timeline she knew to be true. She tried to hold back a sob, but it ripped itself from her throat before she could stop it. Tony opened his arms, and Piper dove into the hug and sobbed. Sam was, well, he didn't want to say concerned, but yeah, that pretty much was the right word. Sam was concerned about Piper, about everything that had been going on with her. She had been shutting the team out bit by bit for the past week or so. Then she almost died falling out the window of Stark Tower. She had been saved by the Spider-Man but refused to talk about it. He'd also caught her sketching a weird briefcase in science class instead of paying attention like she normally did. She was acting weird, was all he was saying. Not that he really cared. Okay, maybe he did, but he'd never tell her that. And maybe he was a bit jealous of her and Eddie talking with their heads together in the corner of the library. Ava glanced at Sam, then at what he was looking at. Oh, so that's why you've been so distracted these past few days. Sam blushed slightly and shook his head at Ava.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Ava smirked slightly. Sure you don't, Sam. She shook her head, pulling another book off the shelf. Sam's eyes wandered to the pair in the corner. Piper was tapping away on Eddie's computer, frowning. She swore and slammed a hand down onto the desk. Sam couldn't hear what she was saying, but she looked very frustrated. Sam glanced at Ava, who was no longer paying attention to him. He snuck off to the shelves behind where Piper and Eddie were sitting. Finally, he could hear what they were saying. Not sure how long this is going to take. This encryption is the most difficult I've ever had to deal with, and it's not even the most advanced encryption software out there. Might have been at the time, but still. Without Jarvis, I'm not that great at this. I need to practice. Eddie shook his head.
I mean, you really don't need to. I don't know anyone who could decode any of this except you.
Piper shook her head. You clearly haven't seen my dad hack into anything. Piper paused. I'm thinking about telling him what we found. Eddie looked a bit confused.
About the USB?
Piper nodded. Yeah. If the evidence on here can prove that our parents were murdered, we need to get it out there. Sam dropped his small stack of books. Piper whirled in her seat. She spotted Sam just as he ducked behind the shelves. Sam heard Eddie stand, but something stopped him. It's probably just some kid being a klutz. Don't worry about it. Sam heard Eddie sit back down. The bell rang, and Sam heard the laptop they'd been working on click closed. You go on ahead, Eddie. I need to grab a few books. Sam began to gather his books and turned to grab the last one, only to find Piper holding it out to him. If you're going to snoop on someone, don't do it to someone trained by the Black Widow. Piper handed him his book and helped him to his feet. We have class, but I'll explain what's going on soon, I promise. I'm sorry I've been such a flake lately. Everything has just been happening so fast, I haven't had time to do everything I need to do. The team got put on the back burner, and I'm sorry for that. I'll try to do better soon. Sam nodded and cleared his throat.
You found evidence that points to your parents' murder?
Piper nodded.
Then that comes first. I understand. The others will too.
Piper nodded. Just don't tell anyone besides the team. Please, Sam, I'm not sure who I can trust right now. Sam nodded and held out a fist to Piper.
We got your back, Piper.
Piper fist bumped him and smiled slightly.